Hi, welcome to 2020 Tasty Treats with GourmetQuilter. I'm Susan Clare, GourmetQuilter, and we're having some fun making a whole lot of little sampler blocks with the surround, and then we're going to add a top because then they're going to look a little bit like pears. So, and I'm using two different greens, so I'm alternating the blocks as I go with the colour so that I can then come back and add all the little pear surround on later on. So there are 20 blocks that we're doing. We're doing one a day for 20 days. We're up to block 8, which means we're up to day 8. And there is a pattern in case you're interested on GourmetQuilter.com. The pattern is downloadable, also comes each day for the whole 20 blocks. And it's going to look something like this depending on which block it is. And so what we're doing is making the block. There's instructions that show you, that tells you what size and how much to cut for each block as well. So this time, because we're doing this block 8, this is like a square in a square in a square. So just a little bit tricky, this block, but really not impossible. So we'll go through it all. So I've already started, I've cut everything out. So we start in the center and we start building out our little triangles. So what I've done here is I've cut my center square, and we needed 4 corner squares because we're going to be doing them on the diagonal onto the background square, that center square. So that was the easiest way to get started. So I have already started. I've drawn a line diagonally on my 4 small squares for the corners, and I've already stitched 2 on. So I've left them like that so that you can see it's not so hard to do. So I'm just going to trim away the corner now. So I'm just laying my 1/4 inch, the line that's 1/4 inch in from the edge of the ruler, right over the stitching line, so that I can trim a quarter of an inch away from the stitching line. So we'll do that with both of those. So it's easiest to do the opposite sides first, like I've done, because then we can press those and then pop the other 2 on. So we'll go through all of this, making sure that we get it right. So again, try not to stretch. These are a little on the diagonal, well, not a little, they are on the diagonal, but they are a little. So we don't want to stretch those seams as we press them. So we've done the 2 opposite corners there now, and now we want to do the same thing, but with these 2 corners. I've already ruled my lines on there, so I can just place those on, and I can stitch right along that diagonal line that I've drawn. So I'll go and we'll get this done, and then trimmed, and then we have to start adding triangles after this. So doing it this way gives us a nice base when everything is so small in the center, particularly on a small block like this. So now I just need to trim those off just the same. And we'll press those. So what we should have is a square and a square already. And this should be the same size as the square we started with. It's just that it's got different coloured corners in it now. So I think that's looking pretty good. So the next colour that goes on is, in this case, it's the yellow. So we've got our squares cut in half, and we're just going to position those right over that seam, because this overlap here will be a 1/4 inch in, so that's where our next seam is going to go. And again, we're going to work in opposite sides. So when we put this one on, we should be able to line it up so that this point lines up with that one opposite there. So with these edges together, you should be able to see that that's in the center. So you don't want it off center, you don't want it anywhere except so that the point is pointing at the point. I'm sure we've got the point. So I'll get this one sewn on, and then I'll pop the other one on as well. I don't want them to maneuver around. You could pin them in place if you wanted to. So we just work opposite sides. And then, so this one, you probably can't see the other corner unless you lift up this side, so that we can position this one nice and central as well, so that that point sits in the middle. So it's overhanging on the edges, and that's absolutely fine. It helps us with the next stage as well. And back to the iron, and we'll press those out. So that should be sitting nicely, and it seems to be, with that point sitting nicely there on the seam. And again, we're just going to do the other two opposite sides. And so that's exactly the same as we've just done. So I might go ahead and do those and then show you the next bit. So I've gone ahead and sewn my 4 triangles on, and it's looking a little untidy at the moment. It's got all these little rabbit ears, and I have to say I've got a whole lot of rabbits in my garden at the moment. Maybe it needs to be out there. So what we're going to do is we're going to just trim that to tidy it, but we also want to trim it to a size. And because we're working on all these funny angles, it's a little bit of an awkward size. But what we want is we want a 1/4 inch line. I've got a square ruler here. It's easier if you have one. If you don't, you can do it without. I want to lay my 1/4 inch marker right on those points and trim it off. But what we do want is we want it to end up the right size. So it won't be a lot of trimming. It's really just a tidy up trim, because we want it to end up being 2 5/8 inches, which is a funny size, but it actually works if we trim the 2 sides while we're here. And by having those little bits off, it makes it a whole lot easier to work with. And then I've turned the square round now so that these are the 2 edges I've just trimmed, and we can line up with a 5/8 mark on the ruler, as well as lining up our 1/4 inch line there for our seam allowance. And it's all looking pretty good, I think. Check that one's right. Yep, that's right, right. So I think that's looking pretty good. There's not a lot to trim, as you can see, but just having those edges tidy makes all the difference. And so now I've got my next round of triangles, and this will be the final round, already cut. And we're doing those in exactly the same way, opposites, laying that on there. The seam should go through that point. This should be lined up with this point out here, so the center of the middle square to that point there. So that centers everything nicely when you can do it that way. So I'll do the 2 opposite ones again, and then I'll do the other 2 opposite ones, and I'll show you, because we'll need to trim it again. So I'll come back when I've got the corners on, because we know how to do this bit now. So I've gone ahead and put my white corners on. That's my final round now before I start putting my surrounds on for the block. But again, it looks a whole lot like it did when we put the yellow corners on. It's a little untidy on the edges, and it just needs to have its final size trimmed. And the same thing, it doesn't need very much trimming. We're just wanting to make it into our 3.5 inch block, which is what we're sewing with. So I'm just lining up my 1/4 inch over the points, and there's just mostly these little bits in the middle that need trimming off, the little rabbit ears, because they're just a little bit untidy. And it is worth doing this. It may seem a little tedious, but what we end up with is just a nice finished block that is super easy to then put the surrounds on, and everything just sits really nicely. So just that little skerrick, and I can press it again just because I like to press everything. And now it just needs to have the surrounds on. So I'll go ahead and pop the surrounds on and show it to you so that we can put it up on the wall with the other blocks. So I've gone ahead and put my surrounds on. I'm just pressing the final side out. And there we've got our little square in a square in a square in a square. So many squares. That block's looking great. So that's block number 8. We can pop that up here on the wall. Oh, they're growing, these blocks. They're just looking so cute. I really like. I love the size, the little size of the block. As I said, they're not so hard to do. We just have to take a little bit of care with the sewing to keep the seams right, because it's a lot of seam compared to the patch. And other than that, that was the Pear Sampler block 8. I will see you again with the Pear Sampler block number 9.